to go. And I'm going to focus on tariffs again today, and I hope I've spoken with Genevieve about getting back to other topics. In particular, I think it might be time to discuss climate change a little bit further in the coming weeks. But for today, I really want to, I think, take an opportunity to discuss maybe some of the deeper issues involved with the appeal of tariffs to the Trump administration, the motivation behind them, as well as their economic consequences. And as you know, this is a moving target. Since I spoke with you last week, the tariffs have been quote paused. We'll talk more about that, but I don't think it's actually a substantial change in the overall exposure of the American economy to these tariffs or of the likely consequence of these tariffs, maybe even for the global economy. And then this morning, another change was announced with electronic goods being exempted from these tariffs. And that might be actually a significant change. But I'll be honest with you, I have not had the time to really digest it. And I don't think, frankly, the numbers have been run to try to figure out, well, exactly how much of the proportion then of trade is going to be exempted from this. And as we discussed last week, one of the problems with trying to be highly variable about your tariffs is that they then become more cumbersome and difficult to administer. So all of that to say, we'll do our best today to talk about something that is evolving. And at the same time, like I say, I want to talk about the broader context, and I want to notice at the very beginning what appears to have caused the pause, right, is the instability in the market for US Treasury bonds. And in particular, I imagine many of you know this already, but the US Treasury bonds tend to be considered one of the safest assets for sale on the markets in the world economy for something like the last 30, 40 years during the period of accelerating globalization. And typically, when other assets become more risky, when markets start to become unstable or to turn down, the safe money goes into where the people who are looking for a safe harbor go into treasuries, among other assets, but it's one of the big assets that people go into. And so the normal relationship, if the stock market is coming down precipitously in the way that we saw in the last 10 days, then treasuries should be bought for more people interested in buying treasuries. And what that means is that the yield comes down. I'll be very brief about this, but there's an inverse relationship between the demand for treasuries and the yield or the interest rate that the treasury pays. And that's because basically the yield is what the US government is paying, the interest rate, in order to incentivize buyers to buy the bonds. If there's a lot of demand for the bonds, then the yield can come down. If there's less demand, then the yield has to go up. And what happened last week is that while the stock market was cratering, the yield on the treasuries was going up, which meant that demand for them was going down, which meant that people were beginning to say, wait a sec, it's not just US stocks or global stocks that are being destabilized by this new tariff announcement and its sheer scale, as well as its lack of preview and the incredibly instant rate at which it was imposed on the world. Um, it's also the case that the treasury market is seizing up or becoming really unstable and in ways that counter expectations for it. And that might mean that the world is not just worried about the economic consequences of these tariffs, but they're losing confidence in the United States government, right? And we spoke a little bit about this last week, that the global economic order that the United States has in many ways anchored for the last 40 years. There's a question about whether we are, in fact, withdrawing our support for the order we've built. And then more generally, if trades are demarcated in dollars, as they are almost all over the world, if treasury assets are this safe haven, and by the way, there are over $30 trillion in treasury assets owned all over the world. And to give you a sense, that's larger, that amount, than the GDP of the United States for an entire year. So, right, there's a huge bank of these assets out there in the market. Um, doesn't mean that the world is looking at the United States and saying, well, not only is it trying to resign from its position as the leader of the free world, as the leader of the global economy, but even if it's not, boy, it just looks too stupid, too erratic, too unreliable for us to continue to consider its assets a safe harbor, for us to consider its currency a safe, neutral median in which to demarcate our trades. And that finally got through to Donald Trump. The previous instability in the stock market appears not to, and it appeared to have led him to hit the pause button. But as we will see, I think the pause is actually exaggerated. I don't know how much of a difference this additional concession on electronic goods or tariffs on electronic goods will make. But I do think that there was an effort on the one hand to uh, try to counteract the spreading panic that this administration was causing, and on the other hand, to have your cake and eat it too, to actually up the tariffs on China and to maintain high tariffs on the rest of the world. We'll get into the details, but there's a question here. Is this, in fact, a genuine pullback from the tariffs that were announced on the 2nd of February? Or is this really just an effort to talk the markets down a little bit while maintaining those tariffs? Before we get into that, I think it's extremely important that we not let the turmoil in the economic markets, the possible recession or stagflation that we may be in for as a result, distract us entirely from other aspects of our politics. And I do believe that we are drifting into constitutional crisis in this country, and that I don't know really how to weigh this. Should we be more concerned about the potential collapse of the global economy, or at least the seizing up of the bond market? And there are, as I tried to say when I spoke with you last week, maybe some silver linings to that scenario. The order, such as it was, did not have some of the capacity we need to manage things like global climate change, hence the desire to talk with you about that next week. And by the way, it does appear to be putting a dent in Donald Trump's popularity, and that might not be a bad thing from the perspective of issues like his ability to continue to use executive power in a largely unchecked way? Um, or is it worse that we are drifting into a constitutional crisis and people don't really seem to be paying very much attention to it? And I just want to argue to you, as bad as a global economic crisis will be, and potentially hundreds of millions of people will be affected by this, and many of them living in very poor places in the world, in the United States as well as the rest of the world. People will lose their economic viability as a result. I think we also need to be concerned about the possibility for autocracy, despotism, tyranny in the United States, the amplification of the attack on universities, right? Just, more and more and more universities are having their funds seized. The desire to put Columbia into some sort of judicial supervision just is a frontal assault on academic freedom, which is incredibly important both to our economy. It's one of the reasons, right? The US has more Nobel Prizes and more patents, not just than any other country in the world, but than practically the entire world put together. Um, and then the assault on law firms, right? More and more law firms, unfortunately, caving to the Trump administration as it really attacks their lifeblood. And the assault on the freedom of the press, the assault on constitutional rights. And that's where I'm going to focus today for the next few minutes. But I'll just say, I'm not convinced that the stuff on this slide that I'm talking about now, on the other side of the scale, the assault on constitutional democracy, isn't every bit as important as the economic crisis, and yet it's being eclipsed, I think, in our limited attention by the ongoing tumult around tariffs. So, one place to focus on in particular is what the Supreme Court has done in the last week. And the Supreme Court is trying to walk a really fine line, a tightrope, between, on the one hand, not simply conceding that it's not going to check Donald Trump and the abuse of executive power, that it's not going to relinquish its authority to enforce the Constitution entirely. And on the other hand, not wanting to provoke a direct confrontation with Donald Trump and his administration. And here I think that right there are a few justices who would basically like to see Trump be able to do more or less whatever he wants to do, or at least are very sympathetic to the idea that we need a more active and empowered executive in the 21st century. And then there are obviously a few justices, three in particular, who think that this is a disaster and a violation of the integrity of our constitutional structure. And then there's the justices in the middle, especially Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. And they seem to be, right, trying to balance both factions, but also to maintain the institutional legitimacy of the Supreme Court. They don't want to run head on into Donald Trump. And so that reticence, right, has led to the series of very narrow and technical decisions. For instance, the Venezuelans who were deported to El Salvador, the Venezuelans who are currently in holding, the Supreme Court has basically said, well, we're not going to decide the substance of the issue of the administration rounding these people up and attempting to deport them without any due process, without letting them come in front of a judge, because the cases were not brought in the area where the detainees are being held or were being held. And I would just note, they have to know that what this is going to do is to create an incentive on the part of the Trump administration to shuffle these people around, to move them from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, to play, right, the shell game with them, such that the people bringing the lawsuits will never be able to bring the lawsuit in the right jurisdiction. And so the Supreme Court essentially just gave the Trump administration an out in their capacity to, right, hold them accountable. That's, I think, one of the, right, cases, or one of the instances where the court seems to be reluctant to do what I would say is its constitutional duty. But I'm going to really focus specifically on Abrego Garcia. I'm using the shortened version of his name, right? The man who was rounded up and deported from Chicago to El Salvador, to one of the most notorious torture prisons in the world today. I've got a little image of it and an image of him on the board. And the Trump administration has admitted that this was a mistake, right? That he actually was under protection, judicial protection from deportation, but then has kind of waved its hands in the air and said, well, we made the mistake, but there's nothing we can do to rectify it now. And the Supreme Court has heard now the appeal on the so-called shadow docket. So there's not a substantial opinion that resulted from this, but it has, frankly, that a kind of legalistic, hair-splitting approach to this case. So Judge Palazinas, who is handling the case, had ordered the administration to facilitate and effectuate the return of Abrego Garcia as soon as possible. She actually had imposed a deadline for Friday, which is what the administration appealed. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can order the administration to facilitate, but no, you can't order them to effectuate, right? And by the way, without defining those terms, right? And so Zenas ordered the administration to both return him yesterday and to report to her on why they hadn't, and the administration basically refused to comply with her order, right? And they seem to be saying two things. The first is that we don't have enough time to comply with your order, and the second is, well, you are trying to make us effectuate his return as opposed to make us facilitate his return, right? And I would just point out to you, for anybody who's been in a court, to basically say to the judge, no, I'm not going to comply with your order, is typically a dangerous maneuver, right? It shows contempt for the court, and typically people who do this get punished. And so the idea that we are seeing a drift into constitutional crisis, it's not happening all at once. Donald Trump on Air Force One said last night, well, he respects the Supreme Court and he wants to do what the Supreme Court tells him to do, but he doesn't think that the Supreme Court told him to return Abrego Garcia, right? And so the subtlety with which the Supreme Court is handling this is giving the Trump administration all the latitude they need to essentially evade judicial accountability for unconstitutional action. And please note, right, the Constitution of the United States protects persons, gives persons, not just citizens, but persons, the right to due process, the right to habeas corpus, the rights that have been violated in this case, and that the administration admits that it violated, right? And so I do think, right, that we are on our way, or perhaps already in the midst of what I've called in the past an interinstitutional constitutional crisis. The executive and the judiciary have different interpretations of what the Constitution allows and who has the authority to enforce its will. And frankly, we're barely noticing it. I don't see it attracting the kind of attention that the gravity of the crisis really deserves. So I'll just leave it there, but I didn't want to let this go unremarked in what we were talking about today. So let me then move on, and I'm going to move now to what's happening in economics with tariffs. As always, feel free to ask a question whenever you have one. So I want to start with the idea that the pause that was announced on, what was it, Wednesday, is not much of a difference between what was announced the week before, right? So we got the 2nd of April and the 9th of April. And what was announced on the 2nd of April, as we discussed last week, was an order of magnitude increase in a day, right? And so it is a shock to the system. It is a sledgehammer to the very fragile structure of the global economy. and it began to actually crack the foundations of the global economy and the treasury markets, the dollar. And so Donald Trump, announced on the subsequent Wednesday, well, he was going to scale it back, only 10% of the rest of the world, but an increase, right, on the tariffs on China. And when you compare, right, what was done on the 2nd to what was done on the 9th of April, what you basically see is, well, it's a relatively small adjustment, coming back from 22.5% to maybe 19 or 19.5%. And the idea that this doesn't make a huge difference, right? And so we can see in particular, right, on April 2nd, the tariffs on China came in at 54%, and then they were raised to 104, and then to 145%. And note that China is the third largest trading partner with the United States, the second largest importer of consumer goods to the United States. And so the impact of simultaneously pulling the tariffs on the rest of the world back to 10%, but more than doubling the tariffs on China, is that this is almost a wash, right? And you can see we've got a large trading deficit with China. We have a large trading relationship with China. And by the way, China has hit back. Um, and this is right the first tariff, and I'm going to dwell on this for a second because I think it's funny, right? The initial response that China made to the United States was a 34% tariff on American goods. Why 34? Well, that's the number of criminal convictions that Donald Trump has, the number of counts he was convicted on, right? And so China is kind of trolling Donald Trump with its tariff response. And by the way, when on April 11th, they went up to 125% on their tariffs, they also said, as far as they're concerned, the 145% tariff is a joke, right? This basically means the two largest economies in the world will stop trading with each other. And then, of course, today, the Trump administration exempted electronic goods. And so this data does not reflect that exemption, but please note, right, that the uh, difference that these tariffs make, right? The adjustment from April 2nd to April 9th in terms of what it will cost the average American consumer are negligible. So this was not probably as much of a pivot or a pause as the Trump administration made it out to be. It did seem to arrest the slide in stock markets, and obviously that's thankful. This is, I think, a very helpful diagram prepared by the Yale Budget Lab, which does very good research and does it very quickly on these kinds of issues. So the total cost of the April 9th tariffs will be not quite $2.5 trillion on American goods, right? And that represents almost a percentage of our GDP, or somewhere between 1/2 and 1% of our overall productivity in our economy. It's likely to increase the price level about 3%. So something like 3% inflation caused by these tariffs alone. And what that means is a real decline in disposable income prior to substitution of around $4,500 per household per year. And the qualification prior to substitution, I'll just say this very briefly. You really like French wine. All of a sudden, tariffs are imposed on French wine, and the French bottle of French wine that used to cost you $10 now costs you $15. Do you just keep buying that wine? Pay more, right? A lot more? Or do you maybe look for Californian or Chilean wine that is almost as good as the French wine and costs now 50% less. And so the anticipation is that the actual cost may be more like $2,500 per household per year after substitution. It's going to cause a contraction in our economy, right, of around 1% this year, right? By the fourth quarter of this year, it's going to cause an increase in unemployment of around half a percentage. In other words, this is still substantial. This is not a major revision. And then looking at what it's likely to do to the economy long term, right? And as you can see, there's a thought that it's already bringing the economy down, that it may bounce back a little bit, but then it's going to continue to go down in 2026. And when it eventually adjusts, right, assuming these tariffs are actually stable and in place for a long time, and by the way, I have no idea if that's going to be the case or not. And I'll just say this very quickly, as I said to you last week, part of the problem here is the uncertainty, right? And if you're a firm, if you're an investor, if you're an entrepreneur, and you're trying to make decisions about how you allocate resources, what you invest in, you are working in the realm of uncertainty. That's a given, right? Nobody knows exactly what supply is going to be, what demand is going to be, how the economy is going to be doing in the future, but you want to have as many parameters fixed as you can. You hope the tax rate will stay the same. And remember, the tariff is essentially a tax. And now there's a great deal of uncertainty added on top of the regular uncertainty. And so a lot of economic actors are probably postponing significant investment decisions until they can figure this out. And then how long does it take? Do we know in 6 months whether or not the new tariff regime globally has settled? Does Donald Trump continue to find tariffs to be an appealing tool in his economic and foreign policy toolkit for the foreseeable future? And so, assuming that these tariffs actually do stabilize, the American economy never comes back up really to the baseline it was. This contracts the economy as a whole. I want to go back for a second and say one more thing about this, right? Which is that the economists and the foreign policy advisors, the people who've been saying that we do have a problem with China. And no, one of the reasons to try to bring manufacturing back to the United States, which on this theory, I don't think it's a good theory, but on this theory, tariffs would do, is national security, right? You want to be able to build the supplies that you need to counter your rival. And those may be military supplies, they may be medical supplies, they may be financial instruments, they may be technology. But whatever it is, if China is now really the rival in a growing bipolar competition with the United States, then being able to produce what you need to counter China's ability to project power, certainly not relying on China to supply you with what you need to counteract China is obviously dictated not by economic but by strategic logic. And in that case, probably the best thing to do is to try to build a coalition between the United States and Mexico and Canada and Europe. And all you put all of those countries together, and you might have a way of containing China strategically. This is sometimes called friend sourcing, right? You figure out who your friends are, who you can rely to supply you with the goods you need in your rivalry with your new rival, and you rely on them. Well, maybe slowly the Trump administration is pivoting in this direction. It's just too early to tell. It's too uncertain. But I do now want to move away from the current economic effects. I'll go back to treasuries in a few minutes, but I do want to focus for a few minutes, and then we'll return to this, on what seems to be driving this policy. And here I'm going to start with the obvious and important uh, contraction in manufacturing as a percentage of the overall American labor force. And as you can see on this diagram, the light blue line is manufacturing as a percentage of overall work in the United States, and that in the 1960s it was over 20%, in the mid 20%. By the way, in the 1950s it might have been as high as 30%, and that today, depending on which set of statistics you use, it's 10% or less, right? And then note, by the way, that jobs that have replaced manufacturing include retail, hospitality, and professional services, and that all of those jobs taken together result in the United States actually having more jobs per capita than it had in the 1960s, and in our economy being one of the strongest economies in the world, if not the strongest economy in the world in the 21st century. But having said all that, I think there is a deeper question here, which is, are the jobs that replace the manufacturing jobs good jobs? Are they as good as the manufacturing jobs that were eliminated? And here I think there are a number of ways to ask that question, or to answer it. One of them would be kind of narrowly economically. Do they pay as well? Do they have as much stability? Are they subject to union contracts that last for years? Do they come with benefits? Do they have a certain kind of dignity that they afford to the worker, or not? And I think there is a widespread sense that many of the new jobs are not as good as the jobs that they replace. A second kind of question would be, well, who gets the new jobs, right? Is it the kind of person who had the manufacturing job? In particular, manufacturing jobs tended to be, on the one hand, available to people with a high school degree or even less education than that. And by the way, they were somewhat dispersed in their location. They weren't concentrated in urban centers. And so if our population is dispersed throughout the country, are the jobs where the people who want the jobs in terms of their location, right? And so I think there's some good argument to be made. I pointed to David Attor, I think last week at MIT, who's making this argument, or who anchors teams who are analyzing what's happened with the decline of manufacturing jobs. We've talked in the past about the research on deaths of despair that Ann Case and Angus Deaton have done, also indicating, look, that the people who lost these jobs didn't get the new jobs. And as a result, they've suffered downward mobility, but also status loss. They no longer feel like they're the backbone of the American economy, like they're respected, like they're dignified, even within their own families. And the result has been painful for them. And so we put this together, and there is, it seems to me, a real and incredibly important concern driving the Trump policy, which is that although the American economy has generated a lot of jobs and is growing, it has been really destructive for a lot of people. Our inequality, as we've talked about many times in the past, has really grown into a chasm between a left out bottom and a highly privileged oligarchy and top in the information economy. And a whole bunch of people just feel like they are left out and ignored in the American economy and American polity. And in a sense, what Donald Trump and his administration are doing is saying, this needs to be fixed. And I think we should recognize that there is a real motivation behind this policy. And at the same time, then evaluate it on those terms. Is this policy likely to accomplish those ends? And this is where I then come down to say so many mistakes. And the first mistake is to believe that the tariffs will bring the manufacturing jobs back. And that rests, as we've discussed a couple of weeks ago, on the mistaken supposition that the only or primary reason that we've lost manufacturing jobs is because of global competition. And it does appear that automation, new technology, and the capacity to integrate productive processes globally as such, not right where the work is done, but just the idea that it's now technologically possible for the work to be dispersed throughout the globe, all of that has contributed to the erosion of manufacturing jobs in the United States. Economists refer to the pixie dust theory. If tariffs were like pixie dust, some magical thing that you could sprinkle into the economy, and the result would be that the trade deficit would go away, right? Every country would buy from the United States exactly what it sells to the United States. It's still the case that that would only bring back 2 or 3% of the jobs. I said that incorrectly. 2 or 3% of the manufacturing labor force that we've lost. So we might go up to 13% of the labor force working in manufacturing. We're never getting back to 20%, right? And I just think that's extremely important to recognize. And then to recognize also, right, if we really want to bring back manufacturing jobs for economic and national security reasons, then probably we need something better than pixie dust, right? The tariffs are this incredibly blunt instrument, as we see, right? Let's start here, right? When we do it, China retaliates, right? And when China retaliates, our overall economy contracts. And the result is that we may very well have fewer manufacturing jobs as a result of tariffs, not more, that more companies may make the decision, even American companies, that it's better to manufacture elsewhere because American tariffs are too high. They're assessed too many places in the production process, and they're also too unpredictable, right? And so this could very well contract our economy, drive manufacturing jobs overseas as a result. And so if we really want to bring manufacturing jobs back, well, we should do so probably through industrial policy, through not trying to keep goods out, but by trying to build up our own manufacturing sector, especially in national security or sensitive industries. And by the way you do that is through industrial policy. By the way, that is a fair bit of what Joe Biden was doing in the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act. And yet there's a problem, right? The problem, quite simply, is it takes a long time for industrial policy to bear fruit. And when I say a long time, 5 years, 10 years, may take longer now than it did before. There may be some regulatory inertia that gets in the way that maybe we should address. But having said that, this is not something you can do in one day. Hold up a big chart in the Rose Garden, and there your policy is. And not that tariffs produce manufacturing jobs in a day, but at least you've done something big and splashy that has immediate consequences. And obviously, Donald Trump is the kind of person who believes that you have to do the big splashy thing. But I would also wonder out loud whether he's got the pulse of the American public, or at least a large portion of it, right in the 21st century. One way to put this is in ways we'll talk about, right? The studies on this show that the people who lost the jobs are not the people who gained the jobs, the new jobs that were created. The idea that, for instance, white working class men, men with less than a college degree, are the ones who were working in the old manufacturing jobs. The new jobs are populated by people with college degrees, women, people who are first or second generation immigrants to the country. The people who saw their jobs disappear, who are hurting, who are injured, who are downwardly mobile and resentful, they don't want to wait 5 or 10 years, right, for the new jobs to come along. I think Donald Trump understands that. And I think he also understands in the age of social media and digital media technology, we're just not as patient as we used to be. And so the idea that the policy that might do the best work doesn't really match the temper of the American electorate in the 21st century is a real problem. Third thing, I think in terms of the mistakes here, the assumption that manufacturing jobs are good jobs in the 21st century. Some of them are, but many of them aren't. And this is because of robotics and new technology, and essentially the idea that a manufacturing laborer in the 21st century is for the most part an appendage to a robot, right? That this is the degree to which these processes have been automated. And by the way, as artificial intelligence gets integrated into the work process, as the rate of technological innovation accelerates, these jobs are probably going to get fewer and worse. And so just look at this diagram for a moment, right? I want you to notice, of course, that this diagram has a slightly more contracted time frame than the diagram on the left. It shows, yes, the US has lost from 2004 to 2020 about 20% of its manufacturing jobs. By the way, Canada has lost about 50% of its manufacturing jobs. By the way, China has eliminated about 20% of its manufacturing jobs, right? And that should set off a little bit of a question. Wait a sec, China's taking all our jobs, but China's shedding these jobs? How can both of those things be true? In part, it's true just because it's a huge country with a giant labor force. But please note, if we go down to the bottom here, right? High income countries throughout the world are shedding manufacturing jobs. Low income countries are picking them up. And that is because manufacturing is low value added labor in the 21st century. And developed countries, high income countries, want high value added labor. It makes their economy as a whole more productive. It makes their incomes higher. And please note, this is, I think, the most telling thing on this diagram, right? Mexico has actually seen an increase by about 10 to 20% of its manufacturing jobs. And my question for you, how many Americans are moving to Mexico to get manufacturing jobs in Mexico? And of course, we know, especially if we put on the Donald Trump lens, that the problem is not that Americans are leaving the United States to go get manufacturing jobs in Mexico. It's that Mexicans don't want to work in Mexico either, right? They would rather, at least a substantial portion of them, immigrate to the United States and work here in an economy with a contracting manufacturing sector. And that just reveals, I think, that what we need to be after is good jobs, right? The jobs that have the attributes that the manufacturing jobs of the middle of the 20th century had, that they have decent work hours, decent work conditions, compensation that allows people to afford a middle class way of life, a living wage, good retirement benefits, good healthcare benefits, worker training on the job, right? We can specify why we like the manufacturing jobs, and then try to create more jobs like that. And I think there are good policy tools to do it. I think the idea that tariffs will bring back manufacturing jobs, that 21st century manufacturing jobs will be as good as 20th century manufacturing jobs were, that's all magical or nostalgic thinking. It doesn't recognize the actual conditions of the 21st century. Finally, the idea that employment doesn't need to be the only path to economic security, I think is extremely important. And here, I'm just going to be really brief in indicating that I am referring to universal basic income. I'm referring to universal wealth programs. We've talked a little bit about this in the past. We'll talk more about it in the future. But I think we need to get our heads around the idea that our economy is changing dramatically from a 20th century economy, that it may no longer be a full employment economy, an economy in which everybody who wants a job can have a job. And we need to figure out if that is the case, and I think there's some really good reasons to believe that it is, how we can secure equality and dignity for everyone in our economy while dispatching with the assumption that the only way to get security and dignity is through paid labor. Now, I'm going to go back to what happened in the last week because, again, I think this is also extremely important. And until the middle of last week, panic was really spreading into the very foundation of the global economy. The structure that supports the entire global economy has a large component of US Treasuries and a stable dollar value in it. And what we saw was not only that stock markets were crashing, and especially that tech companies were crashing, that the level of volatility in the stock market was going up, but as the Economist, not exactly a socialist rag, put it, right, America's financial system came close to the brink. And the full-blown crisis they're referring to there is in the dollar, which has slid precipitously against the euro, but also especially in treasuries. And I'm not going to go into all the details here. I'm drawing especially on Adam Tooze's work, which I think is very important for recognizing how much fragility there is in the global economy and how important the treasury market is, the market in US Treasury bonds is for insulating us, for hedging against that fragility and that risk. And so, as I said, right, this is the overall value of US Treasury bonds in the global economy, over $30 trillion. And this is the value of the US economy in 2023, the last year for which we have good numbers. It was 27.7 trillion, right? So treasuries are more valuable than the entire US economy for a year. And what started to happen, right, as the Economist says, that should not have happened, right? The yield on treasuries went up as the stock market was crashing. That is the opposite of what economic theory says. People should be rushing into treasuries to find a safe haven, to amplify the metric a little bit to see just how unstable this was, right? Look at what happened to the yield on February 7th, February 8th. Right, and there's a question about why this happened. Did Canada and Japan actually orchestrate this to penetrate Donald Trump's information bubble, to finally rattle the cage and say, look, if you keep going down this course, you're crashing the global economy? Did bond traders do this in a kind of vigilante mood and saying, we got to get through to Trump before he crashes the world economy? Or was this just natural withdrawal, an uncoordinated market decision that the US is not as safe as people think it is. It's not to be relied on. The US government is not to be relied on. And I'm not going to try to answer that question. I'm just going to point out, right, that this is really dangerous. And so let me pull back a little bit. And the final thing I'll talk about for a little bit today is this new emerging literature on the use of economic and information based power in global relations, right? And I've got my list of books that I'm consulting to come up with these ideas. We often hear that the United States has an exorbitant privilege in a global economy where international transactions are mainly demarcated in dollars, and which treasury bonds have this status as the default safe asset in the world. And that privilege has different aspects to it. We often, as a country, are able to leverage the reliance on the dollar into greater centrality in the global economy, maybe than the size of our economy deserves. And in particular, the fact that U.S. Treasuries are considered such a safe asset means, well, what's a treasury bond? It's a bond issued by the U.S. government, a promise to repay the person who has bought that bond, the firm, the sovereign wealth fund, etc. And what that really means is that it is a debt instrument for the US government, and it allows us to pay a lower interest rate on government debt than probably the size of our GDP relative to the size of our national debt or deficit should allow us to. So we're getting subsidized by the world government. Now, the idea that we have this economic power combined with our military power, being the largest economy, but also having these instruments that are hegemonic in the global economy, as well as being the most powerful military in the world and the anchor of many of the world's most important security alliances, has given rise to this temptation to leverage the US centrality to the global economic system and to use it to amplify our power. I will just point out that I think this is exactly what the Trump administration is trying to do. I think this is instinctually what Donald Trump sees. I've got leverage. I'm going to use it. I've got power. Previous American presidents were fools not to use their power to the maximal effect. And I think what you get out of diving more deeply into this literature is the sense that it's really dangerous to rely too directly on using the power that the centrality of the dollar and treasury bonds to the global economy gives us. And that is because that power, if used too directly and too aggressively, may undermine the confidence in the rest of the world that actually they should continue to park their resources in treasuries, continue to treat the dollar as a neutral currency with which to conduct international trade. And if we are no longer a safe asset, right, if we are no longer the default currency, the very effort to use the power could, first of all, undermine the power itself, and second of all, undermine that privilege, right? And if, by the way, we do have a very high level of debt, I think that's a genuine issue. If we start having to pay higher interest to finance that debt, then we may rue the day we started using this power or abusing this power, because it could very well crack the very capacity of the United States to continue to issue debt and pay down it's dead. Let me now say one more thing, and again, I'm going to be quick about this, but the work that David Autor does, I think, is really important in helping us to understand, right, that um, employment has changed from the 20th to the 21st century. That's natural, right? We live in a dynamic society and economy. We're living through a major technological revolution. And so manufacturing in particular has shown the sharpest contraction, and other services have grown in their share of employment and in terms of the overall size of economy. And that hasn't been bad for the population as a whole, but it has been bad for certain segments of the population, right? And in particular, right, the people who were doing the old manufacturing work and the people like them in the 21st century economy who don't live in the urban centers, who don't have a lot of education, who can't afford to move to the urban centers, they are hurting. They are angry, they are impatient, they feel aggrieved, left out, ignored. And Donald Trump understands that this is his base and that they are desperate to see him do something effective for them. And there's a theory that they subscribe to for the most part, I think, which is that Donald Trump tried in his first administration but failed. And the reason he failed is because of the deep state and the elite mobilizing all of their resources to prevent him. And so in the second term, the logic of that narrative suggests you've got to be more aggressive, you've got to be more effective, you've got to do more to overcome the inertia and the impediments to Donald Trump's vision. And his entire right cabinet has been built to surround him only with people who agree with him as opposed to people who will try to restrain him. And he is going to war with the federal government itself, the executive branch in particular. He's really using power and right punishing those within his party, those outside his party who resist him. And all of this, I think the payoff to is supposed to be restoring the jobs, the dignity, the status of the people who've suffered from the transition in our economy. And if you believe, as I've tried to argue with you today, that actually the policies being used will not accomplish that end and will in fact be destructive, self-destructive, damage the very people that it's trying to help, and undermine the capacity of the United States to do this better in the future, then it becomes incumbent upon us to understand what we actually could do that would be more effective. And here I'm just going to conclude by reminding you of stuff we've looked at before, right? The idea that the median income, the median wage in the United States is $31,500. That 40% of our earners have, right, wages below that. That's almost definitional, right? That we have become a terribly unequal society where roughly a third to 40% of our population may want to blow up the global economy and may no longer see much value in the American system of government. They don't think the global economy is putting prosperity within their reach. They think the government lacks the capacity to help them. They think our society is too diverse to care about people like them. And then we add, right, the wealth disparity in our society. This is a graphic way to represent it, but 1% of the population owns 50% almost of the wealth, right? 10% own the vast majority of the wealth, and 40% own almost nothing or have negative wealth. we need to figure out what to do to address this obviously unjust and unsustainable condition in a democracy. Donald Trump is doing something to address it, right? And until the Democratic Party, until the people who are opposed to him have some credible alternative, there may be a fair bit of support for Donald Trump continuing down this path. Let me stop there. I imagine you have thoughts, comments, things you want to say. Who wants to start us out today? Flossie, go right ahead. And good job. Wait, you had yourself unmuted and then no, you're still muted, Flossie. Flossie, I can't hear you.
Flossie, we can't hear you.
You got to hold the space bar down or hit that microphone icon.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go
We're
ahead.
talking about the need for education. The ones who are suffering the most may have a high school diploma if they're lucky. A lot of our people do not have a high school diploma. They can read, but they read signs. There's something secretly at work in the way we teach our kids, starting from the elementary school to the high school. Once you get into junior college, you're halfway on the way to being able to earn a living, which ain't much. So we can look at teachers' salaries. We can look at the people who are in charge of what we teach at the elementary school. How much real education do we have? We have to talk about more than reading and writing and arithmetic, but something that ties those skills together. Why do we want to be educated? What do we expect from our ability to read and write? We expect to be able to think, and for some reason, we've been a happy bunch of natives. We've been a happy bunch of people, but something has been left out, and I think we have to look at that. You are working in that direction, but look at who is in charge of our education today. Who is that person? Who are those people? How much do they know about learning, teaching, living? Thank you.
Thank you, Flossie. And I'll say two things, right? As a lifelong educator from a family with a bunch of lifelong educators, and you're preaching to the conservative, to the converted, right? I completely agree with you, and I like the idea that you focus not only on the instrumental but the intrinsic value of education, right? One of the reasons to want an educated populace is because it makes life better for them. It makes it easier for them to make meaning in their lives. And by the way, it hopefully makes them more rational and better informed when they vote. It makes a better right electorate, a better citizenry. But having said that, let me also then add very quickly that education shouldn't end when school ends, right? And so I think one of the places the United States should really be exploring, and it's tricky, it's difficult, it's not easy. If any of this were easy, hopefully we might actually be doing it. But vocational education, worker training education, on the job education, right? So if you're working in an industry where the writing is on the wall that either that industry is going to be eliminated or the amount of labor in it radically reduced or the jobs are going to go overseas, well, our laws, our government should be encouraging those workers and even that employer to start retraining their workers before they lose the jobs, right? And that would assist us in coping with the rate of dynamism in our economy in the 21st century. The other thing I want to say here, and this is a narrower point, right? Columbia University is under attack. Princeton is under attack. Northwestern is under attack. And by the way, Sarah Lawrence College is under attack. We're all in the crosshairs of this administration. And those institutions are places, by the way, where teachers get trained, right? And they're places where, in general, inquiry occurs, debates happen, and information is collected. I spoke briefly at the beginning about, right, how we have more Nobel Prizes in America than the rest of the world put together, how we have so many patents, how good for our economy it is to have this research engine that the universities represent. But it's also really good for our culture, right? And good for our democracy to have communities of open inquiry. And it's not always pleasant. Sometimes it's not even civil, right? That's too bad when that occurs. But the idea, right, that protest, that disagreement, that heated disagreement is a reason to go after these universities, I think is incredibly misguided. Yes, anti-Semitism, to the extent that it occurs, is a problem, as is racism, as is sexism, as is homophobia. There's obviously something already slanted in just focusing on anti-Semitism and using only that at the same time that you dismantle the protection for all these other groups, right? But then you add to that, right, that what's being done is obviously pretextual, right? It's not the anti-Semitism they're concerned about. It's the ability of the universities to collect information and serve as centers of criticism of this administration, right? And so I do think as we notice Linda McMahon being in charge of the dismantling of the Department of Education, and we decry that, we also need to be looking at higher education. Thank you, Flossie. Obviously, I found that to be a provocative point. So I saw Hannah and then David. Go ahead.
Uh, when I first started teaching computer science, one of the hardest problems I had was telling men that it was okay to type. And I'm wondering now if maybe something we could do to help is somehow make men feel it's all right to be nurses, to be taking care of people like us, to be waiting table or whatever. But I do remember, how difficult that was. And once they grasp it, what a difference it made.
Hannah, I'm going to respond with a little bit of levity, if you'll allow me. We need to allow our nurses and technology workers to wear hard hats and work boots, right? And I'm joking about the feminization of certain kinds of work and the masculinization of other kinds of work. Sorry, ugly words, but you know what I'm saying. And the idea that yes, that there's a real problem here, and so it's one thing to say. I think it's appropriate to acknowledge, right? Not everybody can have a college degree. Not everybody wants a college degree.
Or should
And
have.
especially not every 18-year-old wants to go right after 12 years of education, go get 2 or 4 more years of education, right? That's not the way everybody ticks, right? But having said that, a little bit of revision of our gender stereotypes, at least, maybe even, and this is harder, some evolution of our gender identities would assist with this. Yes, so thank you, Hannah. Did you want to follow up?
I just want to say one of the reasons that uh, uh, Donald Trump is pushing manufacturing is because that's manly.
Absolutely. By the way, one of the reasons he's using tariffs is because it's manly to use your power and right, wimpy to not use power you have. Thank you, Hannah. Really good points. David, go ahead.
Well, just first of all, build on what Hannah and you have just been talking about. I can't remember who wrote it, but about 3 days ago or 4 days ago, there was an article just to this point about how there are these subtle appeals to men. And I think part of it is that one of the other things I think that Trump is doing is he can't necessarily deliver on the jobs and on the economy, but what he can deliver on is cultural retribution, which he seems to be foisting upon all progressive and liberal causes and institutions. And that I think is another manly thing, getting even, vengeance. It's a cowboy kind of thing. And I think that that's part of his appeal too. But I did want to go back to uh, talk about the uh, the job substitution of the old manufacturing jobs for the new low low income service jobs. It seems to me that there's two kinds of new jobs. There's the high tech, high education jobs, and then there's the low education service jobs. The janitors and the service workers of the world. And I suppose that neither of those is manly enough for the mega males to either they don't have the education background or skills, or they don't, or they just can't uh, uh, see themselves in those lower income jobs. So I think that's another issue that Trump is using the cultural retribution to compensate for. I did want to speak very briefly to education, having spent my entire career in K-12 education, and particularly at the lower levels. I agree that we can do a better job of not only basic education and making sure kids have the foundations, but what are foundations for? Foundations are only a gateway on the road to critical thinking and reasoning. And we can't ever lose sight of that. That's the real goal. You teach phonics not so kids can unlock words. You teach phonics so that they can become critics of American government and good voters. But I don't think that we will ever solve the the achievement gap or the opportunity gap in education without also addressing our broader societal issues. And those include healthcare and nutrition, income and employment, housing, all those things that contribute to the disposition to want to become good and responsible citizens in our society. If you just look at the natural correlation between those two attributes, you'll recognize that without a broad-based attack on all the other sources of inequality, just hammering teachers and hammering teacher educators is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, to come to your last point first for a second, David. Um, the David Autor and others research that I'm referring to about and so the way this is put is that the incumbent workers in manufacturing are not the same people and don't have the same profile as the new workers in the new sectors, right? And
Right.
one of the impediments to the old manufacturing workers or their children taking on the new jobs is geographic mobility. If you live in, call it Pittsburgh, right? And you own a house in Pittsburgh and that house is worth, let's say, $200,000, right? And you want to move to New York or the San Francisco Bay Area to get a better job, but you also want to own a house or at least be able to afford to live there, right? Good luck selling that house that you own for $200,000 and getting anything within hours of where your new job is going to be, right? And so, yeah, this stuff is sticky. There are multiple dimensions to it. I do want to come back to one other point. You made many points, David, and so I'm not going to speak to all of them. But it also speaks to what Hannah said earlier, and that has to do with the feminization of certain kinds of work, the masculinization of other kinds of work. And I would just point out that there's something else going on here, right? Which is that some of the new jobs just aren't very good jobs, right? If you were a union, right, steel worker, and now you're an Uber driver, right? And there's certain things that are attractive about Uber driving, I think, but it's not the compensation, right? It's not the stability. You're a contingent worker. You make what you make that day. It's certainly not the benefits, right? And in a sense, it's probably not the dignity either or the status associated with it. And so if we took some of these jobs, call it a healthcare worker, and started describing these people in the way maybe that we were during the height of the COVID pandemic. These are our heroes, right? These are the people who are doing the stuff that lets us lead long lives. And we started giving those jobs not just the status, but also the income and the benefits associated with the old manufacturing jobs. Well, that's the kind of thing that slowly over time leads to a change in the cultural resonance of the job, right? It's not a woman's job anymore. It's a person's job. It's a good job. And any person should be happy to have that job and maybe should be incentivized to acquire the education necessary to get that job. Because in the 21st century, you're not going to go back and reopen the steel plant, right? No matter how high the tariffs are. And if you do, the vast majority of the steel is going to be made in automated processes that don't need that many workers. All right, everyone. Great being with you again today. Looking forward to maybe pushing on to some stuff that's a little bit less driven by what's happening in the news this week, next week. All right. Take care, everyone. Be well. See you next week. And by the way, for those of you who celebrate, happy Passover as well. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you, guys. Bye bye. Take care.